There are wooden bridges in America that have been standing for 200 years. Through floods, hurricanes, and 2 centuries of traffic. Still standing. Modern concrete bridges start cracking in 50. Steel bridges need repainting every decade. But these wooden bridges, built before the Civil War, just keep standing. The secret wasn't the wood, it was the roof. And the reason America's bridges had roofs tells you everything about how different their engineering really was. When you drive through rural Pennsylvania, Vermont, or Ohio today, you might cross one of these bridges without thinking twice. The wooden planks rattle under your tires. The interior goes dark for a moment. Then you're through, back into daylight, and the bridge disappears in your rearview mirror. But if you stopped, if you got out of your car and really looked at what you just drove through, you'd be standing inside one of the most ingenious pieces of engineering America ever produced. These weren't quaint relics when they were built. They were the most advanced bridge technology in the world. And the men who built them weren't simple carpenters. They were engineers who solved problems that still challenge us today. This is the story of how America built bridges that lasted 200 years, and why we forgot how to do it. The question everyone asks first is the obvious one. Why the roof? Walk up to any covered bridge, and that's what strikes you immediately. It looks like a barn stretched across a river. A long wooden tunnel with windows cut into the sides and a peaked roof overhead. From the outside, you can't even see the actual bridge. You just see this building, somehow suspended over water. And the answer most people give is wrong. They'll tell you the roofs were for the horses, to keep them calm when crossing water, or for the travelers, to give them shelter from rain and snow. Some will tell you it was for romance, that couples would steal kisses in the darkness between entrance and exit. The old-timers called them kissing bridges for a reason, they'll say. None of that is why these bridges have roofs. The roof exists for one reason: to protect the structure that holds you up, the wood that carries the load. Here's what happens to an uncovered wooden bridge. The first year, it looks fine. Rain falls on the timbers, sun dries them out. Rain falls again, sun bakes them. This cycle, repeated thousands of times, does something to wood that most people don't understand. Wood breathes. It expands when wet. It contracts when dry. Every time water penetrates the grain and then evaporates, the fibers move. They shift. Tiny cracks open, more water gets in. The cracks widen. If you've ever seen an old fence post that's been standing in a field for 20 years, you know what this looks like. The wood splits, it checks, it cracks along the grain until it looks like the surface has been attacked with a chisel. That same process happens to bridge timbers, only worse, because bridge timbers are under load. They're carrying weight while they're cracking apart. Within 5 years, an uncovered wooden bridge starts showing serious weathering. The joints loosen. Water pools in connections where timbers meet. That's where the real damage happens. Where 2 pieces of wood come together, where a mortise receives a tenon, where a peg passes through a plank. Those joints are where water collects. Those joints are where rot begins. Fungus takes hold first. You won't see it from the outside. The timber looks fine. But inside, the fungal threads are spreading through the wood like veins, breaking down the cellulose, softening the fibers. The rot begins from the inside out. By the time you can see it, by the time you can feel the softness when you push your thumb against the surface, the damage has been progressing for years. By year 10, you're looking at a structure that's fundamentally compromised. The joints that once fit tight now have gaps you can fit your finger into. The timbers that once rang solid when you struck them now sound hollow, soft, dead. By year 20, if you're lucky, you're replacing major structural members. If you're not lucky, the bridge has already collapsed, and when wooden bridges collapse, they collapse suddenly. One day they're standing, the next day they're in the river, sometimes with people on them. Now put a roof over that same bridge. What changes? Everything. The structural timbers never get wet. They never bake in direct sun. The temperature stays relatively stable. The humidity stays relatively stable. The wood doesn't cycle through that expansion and contraction that tears it apart from within. Walk inside a covered bridge that's been standing for 150 years. Put your hand on the timber. It's not wet. It's not cracked. It's not soft. It feels like wood that was installed last year. Dense, solid, alive. The joints are still tight. The pegs are still firm in their holes. The geometry is still true. Be 150 years of wagons and horses and automobiles passing over it, and the structure is essentially unchanged from the day it was built. An uncovered wooden bridge might last 10 to 20 years. A covered wooden bridge can last 80, 100, 150 years. Some have been standing for 2 centuries. The math was simple for the builders who understood it. A roof added maybe 20% to construction cost, but it multiplied the lifespan by 5 or 10 times. Over the life of the structure, the roof paid for itself many times over. This wasn't folk wisdom. This was engineering economics, calculated by men who understood materials and money. The first truly sophisticated covered bridge in America was built in 1805 by a man named Timothy Palmer. The permanent bridge, they called it. It crossed the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, and it was a marvel. 3 spans totaling over 500 feet. Stone piers rising from the riverbed, their foundations sunk deep into the mud and gravel of the river bottom. And above those piers, a massive wooden superstructure that Palmer had designed using his own arch truss system. Palmer was a self-taught genius. Born in Massachusetts in 1751, he learned carpentry as a young man and gradually worked his way into bridge construction. By the time he designed the permanent bridge, he had already built several significant spans, but this was his masterpiece. The construction took years. First, the cofferdams had to be built, temporary wooden walls sunk into the river to hold back the water while workers excavated the foundations. Men worked in mud and water, sometimes chest deep, digging down to bedrock or driving wooden piles until they hit something solid enough to support a pier. Then the piers themselves. Stone, quarried from somewhere upriver and floated down on barges. Each block had to be cut, shaped, transported, and set into place. The masons worked through seasons, hot summers, freezing winters. Men lost fingers to the tools and lost toes to the cold. Only after the piers were complete could the wooden superstructure begin. Palmer's crews raised massive timbers, some of them 40 feet long and 2 feet thick, hoisting them into place with block and tackle. The joints had to be cut precisely. The angles had to be exact. One miscalculation and the whole assembly would rack, twist, collapse. Palmer didn't originally plan to cover it. The roof was added after construction, at the insistence of a wealthy judge named Richard Peters, who helped finance the project. The judge understood something that Palmer initially resisted. Without protection, this magnificent structure would rot in place within 2 decades. The roof went on. The permanent bridge lived up to its name. It stood for 45 years before fire destroyed it. Not rot, not structural failure. Fire. Palmer learned the lesson. His subsequent bridges were designed from the start with roofs as integral to the structure. He understood, finally, what Judge Peters had known from the beginning. The roof wasn't an add-on, it was essential. If you're finding value in this story of forgotten engineering, take a moment to subscribe. We cover the trades and techniques that built America, the knowledge that nearly disappeared, the craftsmanship behind things that were made to last. But Palmer was just the beginning. The true golden age of American covered bridge building was about to begin, and it would be driven by a competition between engineer builders whose innovations still influence how we think about structures today. Theodore Burr was a different kind of builder than Palmer. Where Palmer worked with arches, Burr became obsessed with combining arches and trusses in ways nobody had attempted before. Burr was born in Connecticut in 1771 and grew up around the timber framing. His father was a carpenter. His uncles were carpenters. The trade was in his blood. But Burr wasn't content to build houses and barns. He wanted to span rivers. His early bridges were experiments. Some worked, some didn't. He learned from each one. He studied the failures with the same intensity that he studied the successes. Why did that joint fail? Why did that span sag? Why did that arch crack under load? In 1817, Burr patented his arch truss system. The concept was elegant. Take a truss, which is a framework of triangles that distributes load through tension and compression. Then add a massive arch that runs the full length of the span, reinforcing the truss and adding tremendous rigidity. The genius was in the combination. A truss alone can span a certain distance. An arch alone can span a certain distance. But together, reinforcing each other, they can span farther and carry more. The arch prevents the truss from sagging. The truss prevents the arch from spreading. Each element does what it does best, while compensating for the other's weakness. The Burr arch truss could span distances that pure trusses couldn't handle. It could carry loads that would collapse simpler designs. And it did it all in wood. Building a Burr arch truss bridge required immense skill. The arch timbers had to be bent to the proper curve, either by selecting naturally curved trees or by steaming straight timbers until they could be forced into shape. The connections between the arch and the truss had to be engineered to allow for movement while maintaining strength. Too rigid, and the bridge would crack under shifting loads. Too flexible, and it would rack out of square. The McConnell's Mill Bridge in Pennsylvania, built in 1874 using Burr's system, still carries traffic today. 150 years. Wood and a roof. Cars and trucks pass over it daily, their weight distributed through a system that Theodore Burr designed half a century before that particular bridge was even built. But Burr's system had a limitation. It required skilled carpenters who understood the complex geometry of arch construction. The heavy timbers needed for the arch were expensive and difficult to transport. For smaller spans and tighter budgets, builders needed something simpler. That's where Ithiel Town changed everything. Town wasn't a bridge builder by training. He was an architect. He designed churches and government buildings, working in the neoclassical style that was fashionable in early 19th century America. He designed the Connecticut State Capitol. He designed Center Church in New Haven. He was a man of refinement and culture, more at home in a drawing room than on a construction site. But in 1820, he patented something that would make him more money than all his buildings combined. The town lattice truss. The idea was almost insultingly simple. Instead of heavy timbers connected at complex angles, Town's system used planks. Standard lumber, the kind any sawmill could produce. 2 inches thick, 10 or 12 inches wide, cut to uniform lengths. Nothing special. Nothing that required master craftsmen to produce. You took these planks and crisscrossed them in a diagonal lattice pattern, like the lattice on a garden trellis, only much larger. Each intersection where planks crossed was secured with wooden pegs called tree nails. Oak pegs, usually, driven through holes drilled at every crossing point. No heavy timbers, no complex joinery, no mortise and tenon, no need for master carpenters who understood arch geometry. Any competent woodworker could build a town lattice bridge if they followed the pattern. The strength came not from individual members, but from the system. Thousands of small connections, each one carrying a tiny fraction of the load. If one peg failed, the surrounding pegs took up the slack. If one plank cracked, the adjacent planks compensated. The lattice was redundant. It could absorb damage without collapsing. Town was a shrewd businessman. He patented the design and charged a licensing fee. $1 per foot for any bridge built using his system. $2 per foot if you built it without a license and got caught. He hired agents to travel the country, inspecting covered bridges and sending bills to any town that had built a town lattice without paying. The fees made town wealthy, but more importantly, his system democratized bridge building. Suddenly, small towns that couldn't afford a master builder could construct their own bridges. Communities that would have waited years for a skilled engineer could put up a crossing in months. By 1840, town lattice bridges were everywhere. New England was covered with them. They spread south and west. The simple, elegant, infinitely repeatable pattern became the default solution for wooden bridge construction. If you've ever crossed a covered bridge in America, there's a good chance you crossed a town lattice. The pattern is distinctive once you know what to look for. Those diagonal planks, crossing and recrossing, held together by wooden pegs. No heavy arches, no massive timbers, just geometry and repetition doing the work that raw material strength could never accomplish. The town lattice taught America something important. That good engineering isn't always about using more material or stronger material. Sometimes it's about using common material in smarter ways. But the evolution didn't stop with town. William Howe, in 1840, introduced something radical. He looked at the truss systems everyone was using, with their diagonal wooden braces under compression and vertical wooden members holding the deck. And he asked a dangerous question. What if some of those wooden members weren't wood at all? Howe's truss replaced the vertical wooden members with iron rods. Wrought iron, threaded at the ends, held in place by nuts that could be tightened to adjust the tension. This was heresy to the wooden bridge purists. Iron in a wooden bridge. It seemed like an admission of defeat. If iron was better, why not build the whole thing from iron? But Howe understood something subtle. Iron is excellent in tension. You can pull on an iron rod and it resists beautifully. The molecules hold together. The material stretches slightly but doesn't fail. But iron in compression, being pushed, tends to buckle. Long iron rods bend and fail under compressive loads. Wood, on the other hand, handles compression beautifully. A wooden beam can bear tremendous loads pressing down on it. The fibers lock together and resist. But wood in tension is limited by the strength of the grain. Pull on a wooden member, and eventually the fibers separate. The wood splits. Howe's hybrid system put each material where it performed best. Wooden diagonals in compression, iron rods in tension. The result was a bridge that spanned further, carried more load, and used less material than any pure wood design. The Howe truss became the standard for railroad bridges, where the loads were far heavier than any horse and wagon. When the first locomotives started crossing American rivers, they rolled over Howe trusses. Wood and iron, working together. If you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to the engineering and craftsmanship that built America. the forgotten knowledge that deserves to be remembered. Now here's what you need to understand about the men who built these bridges. They weren't academics. They didn't have engineering degrees because engineering degrees didn't exist yet. They learned by doing, by failing, by watching bridges collapse and figuring out why. Timothy Palmer's early bridges included failures, designs that didn't work, these spans that came down. He studied each failure with the obsessive attention of a detective at a crime scene. What broke first? What loads exceeded what the structure could bear? How could the next design be stronger? Theodore Burr lost bridges too. Every builder of that era did. There was no theory to follow, no textbook with the right answers. There was only wood, water, the traffic you hoped to carry, and the physics you were learning the hard way. These men were itinerants. They traveled from town to town, river to river, offering their services. A community would hire a bridge builder the way you might hire a surgeon, by reputation, by the bridges he'd built that were still standing, by the bridges he'd built that had fallen down. A good bridge builder carried drawings, sketches of his previous work, testimonials from satisfied towns, that he could look at a river and estimate the span needed, the piers required, the traffic it would bear. He could name a price and a timeline, and more often than not, deliver on both. A bad bridge builder was a murderer waiting to happen. Bridges collapsed with people on them. Horses went down into rivers, screaming as they fell, tangled in their harnesses. Wagons loaded with goods vanished into the current. Families drowned on crossings they'd made 100 times before. The history of American bridge building includes plenty of tragedies caused by builders who didn't understand what they were doing. The consequences filtered out the incompetent, eventually. The best builders got hired again and again. Their methods spread. Their apprentices became masters and trained apprentices of their own. A body of knowledge accumulated, not in books, but in the minds and hands of working craftsmen. This was engineering before engineering was a profession. It was closer to a craft guild system. Knowledge passed from master to apprentice through doing, not through study. You learned to build bridges by building bridges, starting as a laborer, watching everything, asking questions when you could, and eventually taking on projects of your own. The work itself was brutal. Imagine standing on a temporary scaffolding, 50 feet above a river, in January. The wind is cutting through whatever clothes you're wearing. Your hands are cracked and bleeding from the cold, and you're trying to drive a wooden peg through a hole in a plank, hitting it with a mallet, knowing that if you miss, if you lose your balance, you're going into water that's just above freezing. The crews lived on site during construction. They slept in tents or rough shelters. They ate whatever could be cooked over an open fire. They worked from first light until they couldn't see anymore. When the weather turned bad, really bad, they waited it out. But as soon as the storm passed, they were back on the scaffolding. Men died building these bridges, fell from scaffolds, were crushed by falling timbers, drowned when temporary structures gave way. Their names aren't recorded in most cases. They were laborers, hired hands, the kind of men whose deaths were noted in ledgers but not in histories. The master builders whose names we know built their reputations on the labor of men we'll never know. For every Timothy Palmer, every Theodore Burr, every Ithiel town, there were dozens of anonymous workers who did the actual cutting, lifting, fitting, and nailing. The bridge was designed by one man and built by many. By the 1830s, the craft had reached a remarkable level of sophistication. Builders understood wood species and their properties. White oak for the best resistance to rot. It was heavy, hard to work, expensive, but it lasted. Pine for lighter members where weight mattered. Hemlock and spruce where cost was the primary concern. They knew how to season lumber, how to judge whether a timber was sound, how to cut joints that would hold for decades. They understood hydrology, how rivers behaved in flood, where ice would jam in winter and stack up until it threatened to take out anything in its path. What height the piers needed to clear the highest water anyone could remember. They built abutments that would anchor into banks without washing out, pier footings that would resist the scour of flowing water. They knew their geometry, the relationship between span length and truss depth, the angles that distributed load most efficiently, how to calculate the thickness of members based on the traffic they'd carry. These calculations weren't done with formulas. They were done with experience, with rules of thumb passed down from builder to builder, with intuition honed over decades of practice. All of this passed down through conversation and demonstration and years of watching and doing. The 1840s through 1870s were the golden age. America was expanding west. Rivers needed crossing. The railroad was growing but hadn't reached everywhere. For much of rural America, the covered wooden bridge was the only technology available, and it was good enough. Thousands were built. Some estimates suggest there were more than 14,000 covered bridges in America by the 1880s. They crossed every river and stream that needed crossing. They connected communities. They carried commerce. They became landmarks, gathering places, the symbolic center of rural American life. Some were humble, single-lane affairs just wide enough for a wagon, spanning a creek that you could probably ford on horseback anyway. These were built by local carpenters, following town's lattice pattern or some variation of it. Simple, functional, built in weeks. The kind of bridge a small community could afford and maintain on its own. Others were magnificent. Multi-span monsters crossing major rivers, engineered by the best builders of the era, financed by prosperous towns or toll companies that expected decades of revenue from the crossing. And some of these bridges stretched over 1,000 feet. Multiple spans, stone piers, elaborate truss systems combining the best of several patents. The Bridgeport Covered Bridge in California, built in 1862, spans 230 feet in a single span. No intermediate supports, just wood, assembled in a Howe truss pattern, carrying the load from bank to bank across the South Fork of the Yuba River. It still stands today, still carries traffic. 160 years old. During the gold rush, miners walked across that bridge with pockets full of dust and nuggets. Today, tourists drive across it in SUVs. The Cornish-Windsor Bridge between New Hampshire and Vermont, built in 1866, stretches over 460 feet across the Connecticut River in 2 spans. It is the longest covered bridge in America and one of the longest in the world. Wood and a roof, still carrying cars and trucks more than 150 years later. The toll booth that once collected fees is long gone, but the bridge remains. These bridges became more than infrastructure. They became community property in a way that modern infrastructure never is. When a covered bridge needed repair, the whole town turned out. Men who weren't carpenters learned enough to help. Timbers were replaced according to the original specifications, or as close as anyone could remember them. The bridge was everyone's responsibility because the bridge belonged to everyone. When fire threatened a covered bridge, and fire was always the great fear, the whole community responded. Bucket brigades formed in minutes. Watchmen were posted during droughts. Some bridges had signs forbidding smoking inside. Others had metal roofs added over the original wooden shingles, sacrificing some authenticity for fire resistance. A few had primitive fire suppression systems, barrels of water and sand placed at intervals along the span. These bridges witnessed everything a community experienced. Births were rushed across them on the way to whatever served as a hospital, the wagon wheels pounding against the planks, while a father prayed his wife would hold on just a few more minutes. Funerals processed across them on the way to the cemetery, the mourners walking slowly in black, the coffin carried by men who had known the deceased since childhood. Lovers courted in their shadows, in the darkness of the interior, providing a few moments of privacy in an era when privacy was rare. Children played on their planks, racing from one end to the other, while their parents shouted warnings, their footsteps echoing off the wooden walls. Soldiers marched across them going to war, young men in new uniforms who didn't yet know what awaited them. And some of those soldiers, if they were lucky, marched back again, older than their years, changed in ways their families would never fully understand. Disasters happened too. Floods that lifted bridges off their foundations and sent them tumbling downstream, hundreds of hours of labor and thousands of dollars of investment reduced to driftwood in minutes. Fires that started from a dropped cigar or a lightning strike, spreading so fast that nothing could be done but watch. Ice jams that pushed against piers until even the strongest foundations gave way. Accidents where overloaded wagons broke through weakened planks and horses drowned in the harness while their drivers scrambled for safety. Every covered bridge that survives to this day has a story of near destruction. The flood that almost took it. The fire that came within yards. The ice jam that pushed the abutment but didn't quite break through. These bridges survived not just because they were well built, but because their communities fought for them. Again and again, generation after generation. The covered bridge was where you measured your community's life, the one your grandfather helped build, the one that had the flood line marked on its interior, showing how high the water rose in that terrible winter of whatever year everyone still talked about. The one where you kissed your wife for the first time. The one where you were standing when you heard the news that changed everything. This is why the ones that survive are still maintained with such devotion. They aren't just transportation infrastructure. They're memory made solid, history you can walk through. But nothing lasts forever, and by the 1880s, the era of the covered wooden bridge was ending. Iron had been creeping into bridge construction for decades. The how truss was just the beginning. Engineers were learning to work iron and then steel in ways that made wood seem like a relic of a simpler time. The numbers were hard to argue with. A steel bridge could span farther than any wooden bridge. It could carry heavier loads. It was largely immune to fire, and while it needed maintenance, painting, and rust protection, the maintenance was more predictable than the slow, hidden decay of wood. The railroad, which had once relied on wooden bridges, switched to iron and steel as fast as tracks could be relayed. The loads were simply too heavy. Locomotives kept getting bigger. Freight cars kept getting longer. A wooden bridge that could handle the traffic of 1850 was inadequate by 1880 and dangerous by 1900. The automobile delivered the final blow. When cars replaced horses, everything about road engineering changed. Bridges needed to be wider, 2 lanes instead of 1. The approach grades needed to be gentler. Cars couldn't climb the steep inclines that horses managed easily. The surfaces needed to be harder. Rubber tires wore wooden planks faster than iron-shod hooves, and the pace of travel increased, which meant that the covered bridge's narrow entrance and exit, perfectly adequate for a horse that would naturally slow down anyway, became a hazard for a driver going 30 miles an hour. One by one, the covered bridges started coming down, replaced by concrete, replaced by steel, replaced by culverts where the stream was small enough. or simply abandoned when a new road was built that bypassed the old crossing entirely. The destruction was rapid. Of those 14,000 covered bridges that stood in the 1880s, fewer than 1,000 survived to the present day. Roughly 750 by most counts. About 5%. 95% of America's covered bridges were destroyed within a single century. Most of them weren't lost to floods or fires or structural failure. They were deliberately demolished. Torn down because they were old-fashioned, replaced with modern bridges that were supposed to be better. Here's the dark irony that should make you angry. Many of those modern bridges built in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s to replace covered bridges have themselves been replaced, sometimes twice. The concrete cracked, the steel rusted, the foundations shifted. They lasted 40, 50, 60 years before requiring major reconstruction or outright replacement. Meanwhile, the covered bridges they replaced were 80, 90, 100 years old when they were demolished. And the ones that were spared demolition are still standing, still carrying traffic, still solid. The Humpback Bridge in Virginia was built in 1857, 168 years ago as of this recording. It is still open to traffic. Single lane, weight restricted, but open. Cars drive across it every day. How many concrete bridges built in 1857 are still standing? None. Because concrete bridges weren't built in 1857, and the ones built a century later are mostly gone. If you're still with me, subscribe now. We're building a community that values the knowledge and craftsmanship of the past, the engineering that actually worked. The mathematics of this should embarrass modern engineering. We replaced bridges that lasted 2 centuries with bridges that last 5 decades. We traded durability for convenience. We traded craftsmanship for speed of construction. And we've spent the last 100 years rebuilding the same crossings over and over again because we forgot what our great-great-grandfathers knew. Oh, wood, protected from water, lasts. Wood, joined correctly, carries load. Wood, given a roof, outlasts concrete and steel. This isn't nostalgia. This is data. The reason covered bridges are fascinating isn't their quaintness. It isn't the romance. It isn't the photo opportunities for tourists. It's the engineering. It's the proof that sophisticated thinking doesn't require sophisticated materials. That durability doesn't require industrial manufacturing. That structures built with hand tools by craftsmen who learned their trade through apprenticeship can outperform structures built with power tools according to computer-generated plans. When you walk through a covered bridge today, look up. Look at the truss. Try to understand what you're seeing. If it's a town lattice, you're looking at thousands of wooden pegs holding thousands of plank intersections in perfect alignment. Every one of those pegs was driven by hand. A man held that peg, positioned it over the hole, and drove it home with a mallet. Every one of those planks was cut from a tree, transported to the site, measured, cut to length, and installed in its exact position. The geometry that holds you up is nothing but repeated triangles. But those triangles are arranged so precisely that they've been holding for a century or more. If it's a Burr arch truss, you're looking at heavy timbers curved into an arc that runs the entire length of the span. Those timbers were shaped by hand, often by steaming the wood until it would bend, then clamping it in position until it set. The arch works with the truss, each reinforcing the other, creating strength that neither could achieve alone. If it's a Howe truss, you're looking at the hybrid that bridged the age of wood and the age of iron. Wooden diagonals in compression, iron rods in tension. Two materials, each doing what it does best, held together by joints that 19th century craftsmen designed through trial and error, and that 20th century engineers later proved mathematically optimal. These bridges are textbooks. They contain lessons we've forgotten, and every year, a few more are lost. Today, there are communities that have made covered bridge preservation a point of pride. Vermont has more than 100 covered bridges, more than any other state relative to its size. Pennsylvania and Ohio have dozens. The Indiana, which you might not associate with this tradition, has significant numbers as well. These communities have learned what the original builders knew, that a covered bridge, properly maintained, will last indefinitely, that the cost of maintenance spread over decades is far less than the cost of replacement, that the cultural value, the tourism draw, the simple pride of having something beautiful and historic in your community justifies the effort. Modern preservationists have also learned what the original builders knew about technique. You can't maintain a covered bridge with modern lumber from a home center. The wood needs to be the right species, properly dried, cut to match the original dimensions. The joints need to be fitted the way the original joints were fitted. The pegs need to be oak, not metal fasteners, because oak expands and contracts at the same rate as the surrounding timber, while metal does not. Some of the best craftsmen in America today work on covered bridge restoration. They've studied the original techniques. They've apprenticed with masters who learned from masters who learned from masters. The chain of knowledge, that craft guild tradition, never quite died. It got thin in places. It nearly broke. But it held. And now there's a growing recognition that these structures aren't just historic artifacts. They're proof of concept. They demonstrate that sustainable construction, using local materials and traditional techniques, can produce infrastructure that outlasts anything the industrial age has offered. There are engineers today who are studying covered bridge construction, not to preserve the past, but to inform the future. As concerns grow about the carbon footprint of concrete production and steel manufacturing, as the costs of maintaining modern infrastructure spiral upward, as climate change makes durability even more important than speed of construction, the old ways are looking less old-fashioned and more prescient. Wood is a renewable resource. Concrete is not. Steel requires enormous energy to produce. Wood grows on trees. A covered bridge built from sustainably harvested timber, protected from the elements, maintained by craftsmen who understand the material, represents something that modern engineering has struggled to achieve. True sustainability. A structure that could last essentially forever, rebuilt piece by piece as necessary, never requiring the massive one-time investment of a complete replacement. The men who built these bridges in the 1820s and 1830s didn't think of themselves as environmentalists. They weren't trying to make a statement about sustainability. They were solving practical problems with the materials and knowledge available to them. But they solved those problems so well that their solutions still outperform ours 2 centuries later. And that should humble anyone who thinks that progress only moves in one direction. The next time you see a covered bridge, don't just drive through it. Stop. Get out. Walk inside. Let your eyes adjust to the darkness. Look at the wood. Notice how the grain runs. Notice where the timbers are fitted together. Notice the pegs that hold everything in alignment. Run your hand along a beam and feel how solid it still is. How dense, how unmoved by 200 years of weather and traffic. Look up at the roof. See the underside of the sheathing, the rafters, the structure that exists for no other purpose than to keep rain and sun off the bones of the bridge. That roof is the secret. That simple addition is the difference between 20 years and 200. Listen to the creek below. The same water that's been running under this bridge since before your great-great-grandparents were born. The bridge has heard that sound for 2 centuries. It will hear it long after you're gone. Think about the men who built it, men whose names are mostly forgotten, men who learned their trade by watching and doing, men who cut timbers with hand tools, raised them into place with block and tackle, drove pegs with mallets. Men who knew things about wood and structure and durability that we've spent a century forgetting. Those men are gone, but their work remains. 200 years, no concrete, no steel, just wood, joined right, and a roof. That's engineering. If you learned something from this video, consider subscribing. We cover the forgotten trades, lost skills, and engineering marvels that built America. The stories that don't get told anymore. The knowledge that nearly disappeared. The craftsmanship that made things that last. The next video is on screen now. Click it, and I'll see you there.